Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider being a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts in the link given in the description box. But the least you can do is like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a writer and political commentator whose area of expertise is West Asia. Welcome back to India and Global Left, Mouin.
Thanks. It's very good to be back with you, and thank you for having me.
Of course. Let's start with Palestine and U.S. foreign policy. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's Middle East envoy, in an exclusive interview to the CNN, said he is in talks with various stakeholders in Gaza, including Hamas, about a new ceasefire agreement. After the ceasefire agreement struck on mid-January seems to be dead after 8 rounds of prisoner exchange. Witkoff said that Hamas is being an impediment to the talks, and more outrageously, referring to the US attack on Yemen, he not only likened Hamas with terrorists, but also indicated a possible strike on Gaza. Can you talk about the ceasefire talks, the likelihood of US strikes on Gaza for the first time, and the overall direction of US foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine under the Trump administration?
Well, that's a lot of issues to disentangle. So let me just start with some brief background, and that is that last May, former President Biden, or President Biden at the time, issued a ceasefire proposal that had been crafted primarily by the Israelis, but was presented by the Americans. It was essentially crafted as an offer that was made for refusal. But in July of last year, Hamas accepted that proposal, at which point Israel, in order not to have to implement this proposal, began adding new conditions and so forth. It did so with the full support of the Biden administration. And until the very last day, Israel had the full and unconditional support of the United States to refuse to accept or implement what was essentially its own ceasefire proposal. The incoming Trump administration in early January basically read the riot act to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and informed him that if he didn't accept that proposal, that there would be problems with the Biden administration as soon as it assumed office on January 20th. My suspicion is that the Biden team's primary motivation in doing so was not to reach any kind of comprehensive resolution regarding the Gaza Strip. I mean, it wasn't averse to it, but its primary motivation, I think, was not to have a foreign policy crisis on its first day in office, and certainly not one that included U.S. captives in the Middle East, which, of course, would have brought back memories of the Iranian hostage crisis of the late 1970s, which proved to be the undoing of Jimmy Carter, who had only recently passed away. To give just one more detail, the proposal was not a comprehensive ceasefire proposal in the sense that each party would immediately fulfill a number of commitments and that would be the end of it. Rather, and at Israel's insistence, it consisted of three stages. The first stage, intended to last for 6 weeks, involved a limited exchange of captives, a limited Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, um, uh, a removal of checkpoints that would allow forcibly displaced Palestinians to return to the northern Gaza Strip from the central and southern regions, and a surge in humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. And crucially, also, on the 16th day of the first phase, negotiations were to begin over the details of the second stage, because regarding the second stage, only its objectives had been identified, namely a durable ceasefire, a completion of captives exchanges and a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. But how that was going to be achieved, implementation mechanisms had yet to be negotiated. Now, what happened is that on the 16th day of the first phase of the ceasefire, Netanyahu made clear he was not going to negotiate about the second stage, began dragging his feet on the delivery of humanitarian aid, or rather, allowing the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip by international agencies and others. And essentially, what the U.S. then did is it tried to develop a so-called bridging proposal, because what Israel had done at that point was to propose an entirely different agreement where the first stage would continue indefinitely until Israel would be able to retrieve all of its remaining captives without having to either conduct a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip or, crucially, formally end its genocidal military campaign. Hamas rejected this rewriting and revising of the agreement. The Americans came with a bridging proposal that essentially would extend the first phase, but also have some kind of link to the second phase. And I think at one point the Americans realized that the main obstacle to the United States retrieving captives and dead who were dual U.S. nationals, that the main obstacle was Israel's intransigence. And in that context, the U.S. hostage envoy, Adam Boehler, last week conducted direct negotiations, unprecedented, direct talks with Hamas in, I believe it was in Qatar. And what we now have effectively is that the US and Hamas were unable to reach agreement so far. Hamas is insisting to either implement the agreement as it was agreed in January, or to have some minor revisions and additions, but changes that do not fundamentally revise what was already agreed. The Americans seem to be trying to go the extra mile to cover for Netanyahu. And it is in that context that Witkoff announced that Hamas's counter proposals were completely unacceptable, and made these belligerent threats and so on. I think these have to be understood not necessarily as concrete U.S. Statements of intent, but could very well be nothing more than seeking to mollify Israel and backtrack over statements that the hostage envoy Buller had made, which were regarded as completely outrageous. That, he not only engaged with Hamas, he actually said they were people just like you and me, and then made the absolutely unconscionable statement that these people don't have horns growing out of their heads and we're pretty nice guys, something that's completely beyond the pill. And so I think Witkoff's more hardline statements and threats may well be an attempt to kind of backtrack from that, rather than necessarily being a statement of intent. Regarding your question about whether the U.S. now intends to start dropping high explosives on the Gaza Strip itself, um, I don't think, I suspect, I wouldn't rule anything out. I suspect not, because why would the U.S. need to do that, when it can subcontract Israel to do so? Although, maybe it will want to send a direct message itself. But I think we're now in the phase of each side, trying to demonstrate that it's not going to be intimidated, and so on. So I suspect we're now more in the realm of making belligerent statements in order to improve negotiating positions, rather than actually a significant change of policy. But again, with this U.S. administration, anything in its opposite are equally likely tomorrow morning.
I have one more follow-up on these negotiations, but I think I want to bring West Bank first before my follow-up, given right after the ceasefire in mid-January, and after Trump said that he wants to own Gaza, we saw a massive escalation of siege of the West Bank to a level many said that it's a de facto annexation of the West Bank. We've seen tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 displacement in camp areas in Jenin, Tulkarem, Nur Shams, Hebron, Ramallah, Bethlehem, and you name it, along with massive settler expansion on rural West Bank. Was the January ceasefire uh, can you talk about the timing of the siege of West Bank? Why did it come right after the ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it actually started in late December, early January, so somewhat before the ceasefire. But more importantly, there has been a exponential explosion of Israeli military and settler violence in the Gaza Strip since October of 2023. Actually, since 2022, to a level that hadn't been seen since the Second Intifada that ended in 2004, 2005. So it had already been on a very clear upward trend in terms of levels of violence, number of Palestinian casualties, and the rest of it. I think regarding your question, there are several explanations. One of them is that it is related to the suspension of hostilities in the Gaza Strip, in the sense that Israel is trying to demonstrate that it is still pursuing what it calls total victory, and that what is happening or not happening in the Gaza Strip in no way ties its hands in the in the West Bank, and it can simply continue with this campaign of violence regardless. Another one is that, as you mentioned, Israel has repeatedly, explicitly enunciated its intention to annex the West Bank. And of course, it wants to annex the land, not the people. And therefore, this mass displacement of tens of thousands, primarily from the northern West Bank, plays into that, particularly because I think Israel has an expectation that the Trump administration is prepared to recognize Israeli annexation of the West Bank, whether of the entirety of the West Bank or perhaps what's called Area C, which amounts to some 60% of the West Bank, or perhaps the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That's unclear, but Israel is quite clearly preparing the ground so that when it receives authorization from Washington, it can simply formally extend a claim of sovereignty over these territories with, minimum numbers of Palestinians. And the last point I would make is that this campaign has been very much directed at refugee camps in Jenin, in Tulkarem, just outside Tubas, all being in the northern West Bank. And Israel, of course, sees the refugee camps as kind of hotbeds of resistance to Israeli policy, but is also appears to be engaged in a campaign to kind of plow broad roads, avenues through the center of these camps so that its armored vehicles, tanks, and so on can access these camps more easily. And this is reminiscent of a similar campaign that Israel conducted in the Gaza Strip in the early 1970s, where it just demolished thousands of structures in its 8 refugee camps in order to construct a grid of wide roads in each of those camps. There was an armed insurgency at the time in the Gaza Strip against the Israeli occupation, and this was seen as a way to better exercise repressive control over the camps and their inhabitants.
I just wanted to add that it's not just in the north, the refugee camps in central Palestine, West Bank, and south areas around Ramallah, Hebron, Bethlehem. They are also under the campaign as
Yes, but the
democracy.
campaign is, you're right. I mean, settler violence certainly has been uh, as has been taking place throughout the West Bank. And certainly the Israeli military is not limiting its activities to the northern West Bank. There have also been displacements in the Hebron region, raids into refugee camps around Nablus and Ramallah and so on. But kind of the brunt of this campaign for a number of months has been very much focused on the northern West Bank. And there you have several refugee camps, Jenin refugee camp, Tulkarim and Nur Shams refugee camp, and Tulkarim and Far'a refugee camp outside Tubas that have been, for all intents and purposes, completely emptied of their residents by the Israeli military.
I want to ask you about the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Uh, Given activists have uh, now called the PA as a colonial police state. That's kind of something that began under Oslo when they agreed to cooperate with the Israelis on security grounds. But increasingly, the PA has become less and less accountable. And the Arab League and the US liberal press still continue to talk about the PA as an important stakeholder, not just in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. Uh, Israel, of course, as it seems to me, it doesn't want it because it sees some kind of threat towards Palestinian unity. Can you talk about your thoughts and interpretations of the PA?
Well, it's quite clear that the PA is today nothing more than an extension of the Israeli occupation, and its primary function is a security function on behalf of Israel, where it's engaged in a variety of repressive measures against its own people, and does not even lift a pinky to confront either the Israeli military or Israeli settlers in their unprecedented campaign of violence against their own people that we've just been discussing. And if you look specifically at Jenin, yes, the Israeli military has been attacking Jenin refugee camp for uh, over half a year now. But you had, prior to this latest Israeli offensive, a unprecedentedly large Palestinian Authority operation in Jenin refugee camp, where a number of people were killed, arrests were conducted, and so on. And as we now know, this was nothing more than a precursor intended to facilitate the subsequent Israeli entry. Now, the PA will justify its actions by saying, that what it is doing is preventing the occurrence of a calamity in the West Bank, similar to what we've seen in the Gaza Strip. But that notwithstanding, it's quite clear the PA is now literally kind of nothing more than a native police force acting on behalf of Israel and its occupation, and the proof of this is that its guns are exclusively trained against its own people, and it will not lift a finger in defense of its own people against those who are occupying and attacking them. The other point I would make is that the PA has lost whatever residual legitimacy it had in 2023, and what that means is that Hamas's loss is not going to translate into the PA's gain. In other words, there, if people have become disenchanted with Hamas or opposed to Hamas during the past year, that shouldn't be taken as evidence that they now support the PA. It's often a case of a curse on both your houses. And it's particularly in the Gaza Strip, where the PA is seen as having abandoned the population and refused to, come to their assistance during the Israeli blockade and so on, and even of covertly encouraging an intensification of the Israeli blockade and of international punitive measures against the Gaza Strip because it found its rivalry with Hamas and the campaign to weaken Hamas more important than providing basic support to its own people in the Gaza Strip.
I was wondering how much of a kind of or let's say what's the parallel of this moment with the 90s? And I'm asking this given um, there is a formal kind of diplomatic engagement that you just started the talk with, as we saw in the 90s. And that is followed with a large-scale occupation of the West Bank that happened throughout Oslo, leading up to Camp David, and a massive escalation of media propaganda about Palestinians' refusal to accept peace. Of course, situations are different. Palestinians seem to be more divided now than in the 90s, and the first Intifada that preceded the talks was largely nonviolent as opposed to October 7. But in terms of the moment of deep uh, of talks where the U.S. is engaged and the Arab leagues are there in the talks, uh, how similar is this moment with the 90s?
Well, there are similarities, but there are also important differences. So, in the 90s, you had this Oslo process, which at least formally put reality aside for a moment, but formally was supposed to be a political process resulting in an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement in one form or another. And what we saw was that this diplomatic process, which increasingly became a sham, but a diplomatic process nonetheless, that its main function was to serve as cover, as camouflage for Israel's continuous campaign to change reality on the ground. And so you had, on the one hand, this constant expansion of Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank and so on, but and other activities to consolidate its control over the occupied territories. I should add expansion in the Gaza Strip as well, and this was kind of doing nothing about it was justified by the need to preserve the peace process, as it was mistakenly called. Now, you could argue that there's something similar in the sense that this agreement and negotiations over a ceasefire are being used as a camouflage for Israel to increase its pressure on the Gaza Strip. It has now reimposed a full blockade. It is conducting air raids into the Gaza Strip again. Over 150 Palestinians have been killed since the supposed ceasefire went into effect. But I think a key difference now is that there isn't even the pretense of a political process that is supposed to lead to any kind of resolution of the question of Palestine. No one is even getting within 100 miles of that. And to get back to your earlier question, regarding future governance in the Gaza Strip, well, Israel rejects a role for Hamas. And it also rejects a role for the Palestinian Authority, and it also rejects a role for the Arab states unless that's sending in a police force to succeed where Israel has failed in disarming Hamas and so on. So, um, you know, Israel rejects everything and then turns around and accuses the Palestinians of being the rejectionists. And then its stenographers in the Western media basically parrot the line. I mean, just to take, the crisis that we're seeing now in these negotiations that you asked me about at the beginning of the discussion, it's quite simple. The only reason that this is happening is because Israel not only refuses to implement commitments which it undertook in January when it accepted this agreement, but has also repeatedly and explicitly and publicly made clear that it has no intention of of even negotiating and implementing stage two of this agreement because it does not want it does not want to commit to a formal conclusion of its military campaign. It does not want to implement a full withdrawal of its forces from the Gaza Strip, because once it does so, this narrative of achieving total victory and so on becomes just hot air. The other similarity, of course, is that Israel, just as in the 90s, has the full and unconditional support of the United States. This was, of course, most apparent during the Biden administration, but is largely still the case today.
You mentioned the Arab League and its attitude. So if you can quickly comment on that, because I have one more question. Some people are saying that there is some kind of an autonomous move towards the Arab League from the US based on their condemnation of the siege of the West Bank and the blockade in Gaza, and let's say their 53 billion US dollar reconstruction plan. They're saying that the Arab League is now more united because of the lunacy in Washington and Israel. While they continue to maintain Israeli talking points like Hamas should go, there should be other alternatives, and so on. How do you look at the role of the Arab League
Well,
vis-a-vis Palestine?
what's happened with this harebrained scheme that Trump proposed about, forcibly expelling the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and transforming it into a Riviera or, some, rather than being Soweto on the Mediterranean, it will become Sun City on the Mediterranean. Um, what happened, if you look at it from the perspective of the Arab governments, they have been kind of inert spectators for over a year while Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in their own homeland. What Trump has now proposed is basically to transform the question of Palestine into an Arab problem. In other words, they view his proposal as a direct threat to their national security and to their domestic stability for a number of reasons I won't get into now. But that means that they are now responding on the basis of their own interests. And that's why I would take their categorical and public dismissal of Trump's plan very seriously, because now they are not expressing an opinion in support of Palestinian interests, but are acting out of their own self-interest and their perceptions of their own individual and collective national security and needs for domestic stability. As for $53 billion to reconstruct Gaza and so on, I would take this as seriously as I take any other pledging conference that comes up with similar figures. We rarely even see 10% of what is initially committed, and I presume this case will be no different.
It seems to me that there is this kind of seesaw between the national security stability for the Arab nations and some kind of popular pressures from below, which is much weaker, and so the national security requirement prevails, but there are some lip services because of popular pressures from bottom.
Yes, I mean, popular opinion in the Middle East, I think, is quite clear. It's overwhelmingly and full and unconditional support of the Palestinian people and their struggle for freedom and liberation. The governments, of course, are primarily tied to the West, increasingly have good relations with Israel, which they also see as a security partner, and to an even greater extent than in previous eras, their concern is that if their own populations are allowed to express themselves in, for example, demonstrations in support of the Palestinians and similar activities, that these will then potentially develop into challenges against their own government. So particularly in the context of the upheaval that we've seen in the region during the past decade. I would argue that expressions of pro-Palestinian solidarity are even.
I want to end, Moin, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, I want to end with the targeting of journalists and doctors and students in the United States in connection to the deepening of democracy, as you called it last time I hosted you during the student so-called encampment college campus protest. We discussed the deepening of American democracy during the civil rights, during the anti-Vietnam, anti-American war in Vietnam, and and following the violence, Israeli violence after October 7. Um, eh, the far right group Beitar says it handed the Trump administration thousands of names for deportation targets, and these are deportations of people working legally in the United States. It seems that they are being punished now for the deepening of democracy in the US that you spoke about earlier. Your comments.
Well, I think two things are happening. The first is that I think, Israel recognizes quite clearly that in contrast to its first decades, where it had basically full dominance of the public sphere, and its propaganda was almost uncritically accepted by public opinion in the West, and particularly in the United States. The situation now is, from an Israeli perspective, irreversibly hopeless. You still have kind of some of the older generation, some of the Christian evangelists, some in the Jewish community, but there was, a recent Gallup poll, for example, which shows that support for the Palestinians in opposition to Israel among Democrats, for example, is higher than it has ever been since polling on this issue began. I think what Israel, its genocidal military campaign since October 23, in addition to a growing realization that it is an apartheid state, that it is a rogue state, and so on, has made it has not only made Israel increasingly a pariah as far as public opinion is concerned, but I think it's reached the point of no return. And I think Israel realizes this. And therefore, the only weapon left in its arsenal is outright repression of speech and opinion and activism that targets its genocide and apartheid and so on. So the first element of this is simply a full spectrum campaign to suppress discussion and debate and criticism and opposition of Israel. And that's why these people are being targeted. But there's also a broader campaign here, and that has to do, I think, with the Trump administration's domestic agenda of constructing a kind of authoritarian state, dismantling the role of the judiciary and all these other things. And when you do that, it's often useful to use the Palestinians as a battering ram, because if you can establish precedents using Palestinians, well, then you can use them against climate activists, against women's rights activists, against other communities, and ultimately, against the entire country. So you have this whole campaign against the universities. Yes, it is a lot of it is motivated by the effort to shield Israel from criticism in the universities, but they also want to dismantle academic freedom. So it's kind of this dual agenda that's at play, and the shameless way that, for example, the administration of Columbia University has been trying to appease its critics as if you can ever appease them enough. You know, the idea that for a university like Columbia, $400 million, which is small change compared to its endowment, the idea that they're willing to kind of throw the function of a university under a bus in the hope of saving this funding from the government. And they end up losing it anyway, as anyone could have predicted from the outset, because you can't appease, these people who have an insatiable appetite to repress, repress, repress. So, that's where we are today, and I suspect it's going to get significantly worse because by the time these university administrators begin to act responsibly, assuming for the sake of argument that they will do so, it may already be too late, and if not, they will have a very steep hill to climb to get back to where things were. And last point I would make is let's be fair and not lay all the blame and responsibilities on the current US government. A lot of this started under Biden, not just by the Republican crazies in Congress, but with the active support of the Biden administration itself.
We'll leave it there on that note of pessimism. That was Mouin Rabbani, um, West Asian expert joining India and Global Left. Mouin, thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.